The 4 a.m. inheritance before the sun rose, before the roosters called, before even the oldest farmers in the village had opened their eyes, a father's rough, calloused hand would find his son's shoulder in the darkness and grip it firmly. No alarm clock. No gentle nudge. No second chances. Just that steady, weathered hand in the cold dark, pulling a 10-year-old boy out of the only warmth he knew and into the unforgiving morning air. The boy resented it every single time. He was exhausted. He was a child. And every morning, with every fiber of his small body, he wanted nothing more than to pull the blanket back over his head and disappear into sleep. But the hand was always there, immovable, patient, certain. And that pre-dawn ritual, repeated without exception, pressed into the boy's bones year after year, season after season, would quietly and invisibly become the foundation of something the world had never quite seen before. What if the discipline you hate the most right now is the very thing that will one day save your life? The village the family lived in, a small farming village nestled between mountains in East Asia. They were poor in nearly every measurable way, the kind of poor that doesn't announce itself dramatically but simply exists as a constant, quiet presence at every meal, every winter. Every moment a child looks at another family and notices the difference. Their fields were small and the soil was stubborn. Harvests arrived late, if they arrived at all. Winters came early and stayed long. Meals were often little more than boiled roots, bean husks, and the unspoken hope that next season would be different. The father was a quiet, stern man. He owned almost nothing worth speaking of. He had no particular talent for charm. No education beyond what the land had taught him. No connections in the city. No plan beyond the next planting season. But he possessed one thing in extraordinary. Almost fierce abundance. Discipline. Reign made no difference to him. Neither did illness, bitter cold, or bone-deep exhaustion. His wake-up time never shifted by a single minute. 4 o'clock. Every morning, without fail, without complaint, without requiring the world to acknowledge or reward him for it. And his eldest son, barely 10 years old, small for his age, still growing into his own hands, was expected to meet him there, in the dark, ready. Before the sun had even begun to consider rising, father and son would walk side by side through the silent village, their footsteps the only sound on the dirt path. The boy carried tools that were almost too heavy for his frame. His father carried even more, and never mentioned it. They walked to the fields and they worked until the sun came up. Then they worked some more, when other children in the village were still deep in sleep. This boy was already knee-deep in mud, pulling weeds, hauling water, bending his small back to the cold earth, learning without words what it meant to be responsible for something beyond yourself, the father once told him. Quietly, without drama, if you want your brothers and sisters to have land, to have homes, to have futures, you must work harder than anyone. You are the eldest. Everything begins with you. The boy didn't fully understand those words. He wasn't sure he even agreed with them, but he obeyed. Not because he was forced to, but because his father didn't teach through speeches or arguments. He taught through action. Every single morning at 4 o'clock. The mother was a different kind of teacher, and in many ways, an even more powerful one. She never raised her voice. She never lectured about duty or perseverance. She never sat her children down and explained the importance of hard work. She simply worked endlessly, quietly, without complaint, in a way that needed no explanation. When she wasn't in the fields beside her husband, she raised silkworms at home. In spring, she and the boy would climb high into the mountain paths together, collecting mulberry leaves to feed the worms. The paths were steep and punishing. The baskets grew heavy long before they reached the top, and yet she never once suggested turning back. She simply kept walking, and the boy kept walking behind her. After the silkworm season ended, she spent the summer spinning thread and weaving cloth by hand. In autumn, she returned to the fields for harvest. In winter, she repaired clothes and prepared for the next planting season. There was no vacation, no season of rest, no month that passed without purpose and effort. The boy watched his parents constantly during those years, perhaps without fully realizing he was doing so. He watched his father rise before the world without being asked. He watched his mother move through every season without a single visible moment of self-pity or surrender. And without knowing it, without anyone naming it or framing it as a lesson, something was being planted deep inside him. Not knowledge, not money, not the kind of opportunity that comes from connections or luck, something quieter, something more durable. The habit of relentless, disciplined, uncomplaining work. He didn't yet understand its value. He couldn't have. He was a child carrying tools that were too heavy for him. But that invisible inheritance was already taking root, growing slowly in the dark, the way the most important things always do. The question that wouldn't leave even as he worked, even as he honored his parents through obedience and effort. A question burned quietly inside him like an ember that refused to go out every evening. After hours in the fields, after his body ached and his hands were raw, he would look down at his fingers, rough, cracked, stained with soil that never fully washed away. Then he would look at his father's hands. The same, only worse, mapped with years of labor, bent slightly at the joints from decades of gripping tools before the sun rose. Then at his mother's hands, thin, never still, always moving toward the next task. 3 generations of extraordinary effort. 3 generations of people who worked harder than almost anyone around them. And still, they had almost nothing to show for it beyond survival. One night, lying on the floor in the dark, unable to sleep, the boy whispered to no one in particular, "My parents work harder than anyone I know. And yet we are still poor. Is hard work alone truly enough? Is there something more? Some other layer? Some missing piece that makes effort count for something beyond just getting through the next season?" He had no answer. He was 14 years old and living in a mountain village with empty pockets and roughened hands. But the question lodged itself somewhere permanent inside him, and it would drive him through failures and humiliations he couldn't yet imagine, towards something neither he nor his parents could see from where they stood. For escapes the first time he ran. He was 14. He had found a newspaper, a rare and almost miraculous object in his world, advertising construction work in a distant city, an airport, a steel factory, jobs that paid actual wages in actual currency, wages untied from soil and weather and the mercy of the harvest. His heart raced reading the words. He gathered a friend, packed almost nothing, and walked for days until they found work laying railroad tracks. The labor was brutal. But for the first time in his life, the boy held money he had earned in a world beyond his village. He felt the intoxicating taste of a different kind of life. Life with edges and possibilities he had never touched before. Then his father appeared at the work site. "You are the pillar of this family," his father said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Without you, everything falls apart." The boy went home. But the memory of that distant city, of those wages, and that feeling of possibility would not leave him. Months later, he tried again, this time heading directly for the capital. A stranger on the road promised him a hotel job and asked for money up front as a deposit. The boy handed over everything he had. The man vanished, penniless and completely lost in a city that didn't know his name. The boy was eventually found by a relative and brought home in humiliation. The 3rd attempt was his boldest and his most costly. He made the kind of decision that desperate people make when they have run out of patience with small options. He sold one of his father's cows, the family's single most valuable possession, the animal that represented an entire season of security, and used the money to enroll himself in an accounting school in the capital. For 2 months, he sat in a classroom and studied numbers, ledgers, profit margins, and business principles. His mind came alive in a way it never had in the fields. The world of commerce, of tracking what came in and what went out, of understanding how small decisions compound into large outcomes, felt like a language. He had always been meant to speak. Then his father appeared in the doorway of the classroom, this time. The old farmer did not shout. He did not make threats or demands. He simply stood there, a man who had woken every morning of his adult life before 4 o'clock, who had never complained about a single one of those mornings, who had given every ounce of his strength to hold a family together in a village that offered very little in return. And he wept, not dramatically, not loudly, just the quiet, helpless tears of a man who never cried, standing in a doorway he hadn't expected to find himself in. The boy rose from his desk and followed his father home, not because he had given up on his dream, not because he had stopped believing in a different life, but because the tears of a man who never cries are the one argument that cannot be answered. The winter of failure back in the village. Winter arrived with a cruelty that seemed almost personal. The harvest had failed again. Meals shrank to almost nothing. Bean husks, boiled roots, whatever the earth in the pantry had left to offer. The house was freezing. His 7 younger siblings huddled together for warmth under whatever blankets existed. The air inside felt as cold as the air outside. The boy sat alone in a corner of that frozen house, staring at nothing. 3 attempts. 3 failures. 3 times he had reached for a different life, and 3 times the door had slammed shut through bad luck, bad judgment, and the unbearable weight of family obligation. He had nothing. He had nowhere to go. He had no remaining plan. Then, slowly, he remembered a story his grandfather had told him years before. A small green frog who wanted to reach a high branch on a willow tree. The branch seemed impossibly far above. The frog leaped and fell again. 10 times, 20, 30, each attempt ending the same way, in failure, in the mud, at the base of the tree. But the frog never stopped, and on one otherwise unremarkable jump, not the most powerful, not the most graceful, it reached the branch. The boy sat with that image in the dark and cold for a long time. Then he closed his eyes and whispered, very quietly, "Am I truly less determined than a small green frog?" The 4th departure, when the snow began to melt and the paths became passable again, the boy left home for the 4th and final time. He carried almost nothing visible. No money, no connections, no plan elaborate enough to be called a strategy. Just the clothes on his back and one invisible thing, something so deeply embedded in him. By years of 4 o'clock mornings and silent, tireless seasons that he didn't even recognize it as a possession, the discipline his parents had planted in him. One dark morning at a time, for over a decade, he arrived in the capital and found work as a laborer, carrying bricks, mixing concrete, hauling materials at a school construction site. The work was punishing. His body ached in ways that sleep barely repaired. But something in him moved differently from the other workers, and the foreman noticed it without being able to fully explain why. While others complained about early shifts, he was already there. While others moved at the pace of reluctance, he moved with a quiet urgency that had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with habit. He had been trained since the age of 10 to be already working, while the rest of the world was still deciding whether to get up. His father, without knowing it, had built a machine inside him. A machine that ran on discipline rather than motivation, on habit rather than inspiration. And now that the fields were gone, that machine was searching for a new purpose. The rice shop arrived in the form of an unremarkable job listing. A small rice shop in a busy neighborhood needed a delivery boy. The compensation was almost nothing, no salary at all, in fact. Just 3 meals a day and a small portion of rice at the end of each month. Most young men with any other options would have walked past it without a second glance. The boy took the job before the owner finished explaining it. He arrived at the shop each morning before the owner unlocked the door, a habit so carved into his biology that he couldn't have slept past it if he tried. He swept the floors without being asked. He organized the inventory with a precision that surprised the old owner. He arranged every sack with care, tracked what was running low, anticipated what would be needed before anyone mentioned it, but it was his relationship with the customers that set him apart most visibly. He memorized their names, He remembered their families, their preferences, the details they mentioned in passing, and never expected anyone to retain. He carried loads that made his shoulders burn and his legs shake, and he did it without slowing down, without grimacing, without ever giving a customer a reason to feel they were an inconvenience. The old shop owner, a quiet, observant man who had spent decades watching people, began paying close attention one evening. After the last customer had gone and the shop had grown still, the old man sat beside the young worker and reached into a small bowl on the counter. He lifted a single grain of rice between his thumb and forefinger and held it up in the dim light. "Do you see this?" he asked. The boy nodded. "1 grain. It looks like nothing at all. You could drop it on the floor right now, and not a single person in this city would bend down to pick it up." He set the grain gently on the table between them. "But take this 1 grain and place it in good soil. Water it every day. Protect it from the cold and the insects and the drought. Be patient with it, genuinely patient, not the impatient kind that pretends to wait while watching the clock. And from this single, seemingly worthless grain, an entire field will eventually grow. Enough to feed a family, enough to build a life, enough to change the direction of everything." The old man looked at the boy steadily. "That is what you are right now. You think you are small. You think you are nobody, a delivery boy in a rice shop that most people in the city have never heard of. But every morning, you are here before me. Every task I give you, you complete before I expect it. Every customer who walks through that door remembers your name and comes back. You don't see it yet, but you are already planted in good soil. Now, you simply need to keep growing." The connection that night, lying on the floor of the shop's back room, with nothing but a thin mat between him and the cold boards. The boy turned the old man's words over and over in his mind, and then, slowly, something connected, something that had been trying to connect for years, without quite finding its way, his father waking him at 4 a.m, every morning, without exception. That was the planting. His mother climbing steep mountain paths in spring, spinning thread in summer, harvesting in autumn, repairing and preparing through winter, moving through every season, without a single visible moment of surrender. That was the watering. The years of backbreaking labor in fields that gave back barely, enough to survive, years that had felt, from the inside, like nothing but suffering and limitation. Those weren't wasted years. That was the soil being prepared. Everything his parents had given him. Not money, not formal education, not the kind of opportunity that opens doors before you've even knocked, but the deep, structural habit of showing up, of working harder than the situation required, of refusing to stop when stopping would have been entirely understandable. That was the only inheritance he had ever needed. And now, in this small rice shop on a busy street in a city far from the mountains where he was born, that inheritance was finally beginning, quietly, visibly, unmistakably, to grow. The books. There was one more thing the boy had carried from his past. Something easily overlooked amid all the failure and heartbreak of that. Period. 2 months of accounting school, cut short by a father's tears in a classroom doorway. 2 months out of what should have been 2 years. Incomplete, interrupted, seemingly wasted, but not wasted. He began applying those partial, unfinished lessons to the shop's finances, carefully at first, then with growing confidence. He organized the ledger into something logical and readable. He tracked expenses against revenue with a clarity the old owner had never experienced in decades of running the business. He calculated margins, identified waste, spotted patterns in customer behavior that suggested opportunities the old man had been sitting on without knowing. The owner sat with those organized pages one evening and looked up at the young man with an expression somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. "I have run this shop for longer than you have been alive," he said quietly. "And I have never understood my own business the way these pages explain it." Within 6 months, the young man had full responsibility for the financial side of the operation, not because he was a trained accountant, not because he was naturally gifted with numbers beyond anyone else, but because too stolen. Interrupted, seemingly failed months of education, combined with 4 in the morning habits and a mother who never stopped working, had turned out to be exactly enough. The gift 4 years passed. At the rice shop, 4 years of arriving before dawn, just as his father had taught him without ever using the word taught. 4 years of moving through every season of the business without complaint, just as his mother had shown him without ever calling it a lesson. 4 years of never cutting corners, never doing less than his absolute best, never allowing the smallness of the job to become an excuse for small effort. The shop transformed around him. Its reputation spread steadily outward through the neighborhood, then beyond it. Customers came from farther and farther away, not because the rice was uniquely special, but because they trusted the young man who ran the place. The inventory was always fresh. The accounts were always accurate. The service was always personal in a way that felt rare in a busy city. Then one afternoon, the old owner called the young man into the back office and closed the door. He explained that his own son, his blood, his intended heir, had been living recklessly for years, spending money without regard, ignoring the business entirely, showing no interest in or aptitude for carrying forward what his father had spent a lifetime building. The old man had watched and hoped and waited for something to change. It hadn't. He looked at the young man standing before him, the boy who had arrived with nothing but worn clothes and invisible habits, who had not missed a single early morning in 4 years, who had turned a simple neighborhood rice shop into the most reliable and respected business on the street. "I am retiring," the old owner said, his voice quiet and certain. "I am returning to my hometown, and I am leaving the shop to you." The young man, 22 years old, 4 escapes behind him, 3 humiliating returns, cheated once. Heartbroken more times than that, the memory of his father's tears still present somewhere in the back of his chest, stood in complete silence for a long moment. Then he bowed deeply, the way his parents had taught him to bow, and said, "Everything I am came from my parents and from you. I will not waste this." What grew from a single grain, that rice shop, was not the destination. It was the first branch the frog finally reached. The discipline he had inherited, the 4 o'clock mornings, the relentless work ethic, the deep structural refusal to stop when stopping felt justified, became the engine that drove everything that followed. Not talent, not luck, not a single moment of inspired genius, just the compound interest of showing up every day before the world required it. Over the decades that followed, the young man expanded into construction, then manufacturing, then engineering, then eventually automobile production. Cars that bore his nation's name and traveled roads around the world. From a single rice shop on a busy city street, inherited at 22 by a boy who had grown up in a mountain farming village without enough food to fill his stomach, grew one of the largest and most consequential industrial companies his nation had ever produced. A company that built highways and launched ships and employed hundreds of thousands of people who each had their own 4 o'clock mornings waiting to begin. But if you asked him at any point in that long journey, at any level of success or recognition, where it had all truly started, his answer was always the same. Not the rice shop, not the capital, not the construction sites or the factory floors. It started at 4 in the morning, in a dark village between mountains, with a father's calloused hand on a small boy's shoulder, saying nothing more complicated than, "Wake up. It's time to work." What this story is actually about. Most of us spend our lives looking for the moment, the lucky break, the right connection, the single decision that changes everything. The shortcut that gets us from where we are to where we want to be without requiring the years in between. This man never found any of those things. Not once. Every door he approached either slammed shut or required him to pay a price he hadn't anticipated. Every attempt at a different life ended in failure, humiliation, or a tearful father in a doorway. What he found instead was something quieter, less dramatic, and infinitely more durable. And it is worth naming clearly. The first truth: discipline is not a personality trait. It is not something you either have or don't have. It is a practice, a habit that can be built deliberately, starting at any point by any person, regardless of what their parents taught them or failed to teach them. If no one woke you at 4 in the morning when you were 10 years old, you can set your own alarm today. This specific hour is almost beside the point. What matters is the choice to show up before the world requires it, before the rewards are visible, before anyone is watching or applauding or keeping score. The second truth: no honest work is wasted. Every sack of rice he carried built his endurance. Every row of crops he weeded as a child built his patience. Every hour he spent bent over a ledger built his business instincts. The work that feels meaningless right now, the job that seems beneath you, the season that appears to be leading nowhere, may be preparing the soil in which everything you actually want will eventually grow. You cannot always see what is being built while you are inside the building of it. The third truth: the people who construct lasting things are rarely the most talented, the most connected, or the most fortunate. They are most often simply the ones who kept working after everyone else sat down and declared the effort unreasonable. Success, real, durable, compounding success, is not a single moment of inspiration that the world later recognizes. It is years of quiet, largely invisible repetition that suddenly, one day, becomes impossible for the world to ignore. Empires are not built in a single day. They are not built by people who were handed the right circumstances, or who stumbled into the right moment, or who were simply too talented to fail. They are built at 4 in the morning, one day at a time, by people who understood, or who were taught, through a rough hand on a small shoulder in the darkness before dawn, that the most important work happens before the world wakes up and before anyone is there to see it. Your parents may have planted seeds in you that haven't broken the surface yet. Things you watched without knowing you were watching. Lessons you absorbed without knowing they were being given. Water them. Protect them. Be patient with them. The harvest is still coming.